The Oklahoma City Butcher is the name given to an unidentified serial perpetrator believed to have slain three women in Oklahoma City between 1976 and 1986. This case stands out as one of the city's most chilling, unsolved mysteries, especially given the horrific nature of the acts which were perpetrated. All known victims were young, homeless Native American women, a fact that helped investigators link the crimes. The case first came to public attention on April 1st, 1976, when three workers inspecting an abandoned house on 6th Street in Oklahoma City made a horrifying discovery. Inside the dilapidated house, the men noticed a foul odor and stumbled upon a head hidden in a box. Police responding to the scene found that body parts were scattered throughout the house, and the victim's face had been given a Glasgow smile. If you've ever seen the show Sons of Anarchy, you'll immediately know what I'm talking about. At the time, the victim couldn't be identified. With no immediate leads, this slaying gained some media attention initially, but soon faded from headlines. Investigators had little to go on. The victim was a young Native American woman, but her name remained unknown for years. It wasn't until 1993 that additional testing finally identified her as Kathy Lynn Shackelford, who had run away from home at 17. This belated identification gave some closure to her family, but came long after the trail for the perpetrator had gone cold. For 3 years, the 1976 act appeared to be a disturbed, isolated incident. Then, on April 19, 1979, another grisly discovery was made in a northeast Oklahoma City neighborhood. In a scene out of a horror film, people observed a dog dragging what turned out to be a head down the street, all in broad daylight. Police were alerted and over the next several days recovered more body parts of the victim scattered around the area, some wrapped in butcher paper or newspapers. Media reports at the time referred to the parts being wrapped up butcher shop style. Unlike the first case, this time authorities quickly identified the victim as 22-year-old Arlie Bell Killian via fingerprints. Killian was a young Native American woman known to have struggled with substance issues and homelessness. The community was terrified by the macabre scene that unfolded in their neighborhood. Residents grew anxious not knowing who could commit such a heinous act. Law enforcement launched an intensive investigation and even developed a couple of early suspects. One suspect was the victim's own brother, who had escaped from a mental hospital on the very day Arlie was slain. He had a violent history and had previously been arrested for slaughtering pets with a hatchet. Given this background and the uncanny timing of his escape, police initially considered him a strong suspect and subjected him to hours of questioning. However, as the investigation continued, doubts arose about the brother's involvement. Crucially, additional parts of Arlie's body kept appearing around the city, even after Arlie's brother had been taken into custody on April 24, 1979. These were in highly public areas, intended to specifically cause fear in the community. Arlie's brother was ultimately cleared as a suspect, with his escape coming to be seen as merely a very timely coincidence, and the second investigation hit a dead end. Importantly, and unfortunately, crucial initial investigative resources were ultimately wasted by going down this initially very promising rabbit hole. And that's not a criticism of the investigation whatsoever, especially given the timing of his escape and the brother's history of violence. Community concern led to public meetings of worried citizens, but with no new leads, the case went cold again in the following years. 7 years would pass before the butcher struck again, if indeed it was the same perpetrator, and this time the authorities would try to handle the three cases holistically. On March 6, 1986, a man in Oklahoma City found portions of a body behind his house. Police were called to collect the remains, and within a week, yet another grim discovery was made. The victim's head was found in a nearby garbage bin nearby. In this case, the perp had attempted to destroy evidence by setting the remains on fire, leaving the head badly charred when found. Despite this, the victim was identified almost immediately as 22-year-old Tina Sanders. She had distinctive tattoos on her body, which helped authorities confirm her identity. Like the previous victims, Tina Sanders was a young Native American woman who was experiencing homelessness at the time. Witnesses reported she was last seen alive just one day before her remains were found. The extreme brutality and the familiar pattern clearly echoed the earlier unsolved cases. Within a few weeks, Oklahoma City police publicly announced that they believed all three slayings in 1976, 1979, and 1986 were linked to a single serial predator. Investigators noted the common signature in each crime. Notably, in a shocking twist, the police also revealed that in all cases the women had distinctive parts of their anatomy removed. These parts were never recovered, unlike the other body parts, leading to speculations as to why this additional cruelty was inflicted. It was also significant that all three victims shared a similar profile, young Native American women living transient lifestyles, which likely made them targets of opportunity. This was the first time authorities publicly used the moniker Oklahoma City Butcher for the perpetrator. The revelation that a serial perp had been operating, albeit infrequently, for a decade was shocking for the community, and initially significant investigative resources were assigned. Despite thorough investigations, however, no solid leads emerged after 1986. The cold case investigator who has led the file in recent years noted in an interview that he believed that this case could have been solved had it been given sustained significant attention at the time. However, he noted that because the women were homeless, Native American, and had been living on the outskirts of life, resources weren't properly allocated to the cases. Over the years, several theories and suspects have been proposed by law enforcement officials, forensic experts, and amateur sleuths, but none have been proven. One prominent theory in the 1980s was that the perpetrator might be Henry Lee Lucas, a drifter from Texas. Lucas was arrested in 1983 and became infamous for confessing to hundreds of crimes nationwide, most of which he didn't actually commit. During his confession spree, Lucas admitted to slaying Arlie Bell Killian, the 1979 victim, and so he was considered a serious suspect for a time. Oklahoma City investigators traveled to interview Lucas in prison, hoping his information would solve the case. However, as they probed deeper, it became evident that Lucas's story did not hold up, and he knew nothing about the case except what was in the public record. Further, he was incarcerated at the time of the third attack, which, if the theory that all three acts were committed by the same person is accurate, obviously discredits him. Given the methods employed by the perp and the use of actual butcher paper, some have speculated that the Oklahoma City Butcher was, in fact, a literal butcher. Others have speculated he may have had medical or other sorts of anatomical training. One puzzling aspect of the case is the long gaps between the slayings. Roughly 3 years between the first and second, then a 7-year gap before the third. Such long cooling-off periods aren't typical for serial perpetrators, who often escalate or operate in closer intervals. This has led to theories that the Oklahoma City Butcher might have been unable to attack during those years. Some have speculated that he may have been incarcerated for other crimes, or even serving in the military and stationed elsewhere. If, for example, the perpetrator was jailed in the early 1980s and released by the mid-1980s, that could explain why no acts occurred in that window. Alternatively, the individual might have simply left the area and then later returned. Another theory to explain the gaps suggests that he was perhaps a long-haul truck driver, though there's no direct evidence of this. However, circumstantial evidence suggests that he could have struck in other areas, meaning that the cooling-off period issue isn't the factor it appears to be. Still another theory suggests that the first two slayings are independent of the third, suggesting a copycat-style attack. This is considered unlikely as many of the details of the 1976 and 1979 slayings weren't made public until after 1986. The Smurfette Jane Doe is the nickname given to an unidentified teenage girl whose body was found discarded in Houston, Texas, in October 2012. More than a decade later, her true name and story remain unknown. On October 16, 2012, an anonymous tip led Houston authorities to the remains of a young female concealed in 2 black trash bags near a gated driveway off Walters Road. The location was a lightly traveled spot by an oil field access road about 25 feet from the roadside. Notably, according to most sources, this area is known for a wide variety of illicit activities. The victim's body was in an advanced state of decomposition. Her left hand and left foot were missing, likely due to animal scavenging. Forensic examiners estimated she had been deceased for approximately 3 to 6 weeks by the time of discovery, placing her time of death around September 2012. Due to the condition of her remains, a precise cause of death could not be determined. That said, investigators treated the case as a likely slaying, since the effort to hide the body very strongly suggested foul play. Investigators quickly gathered details about the victim in hopes of identifying her. She was determined to be a teenage girl between about 15 and 17 years old, with a petite build. She had shoulder-length, dark brown, wavy or curly hair, which was found held back from her face with a simple bobby pin. Notably, she was found fully clothed. She wore tan cargo pants and a distinctive blue-green t-shirt featuring the cartoon character Smurfette, along with the phrase, "He smurfs me, he smurfs me not." Forensic analysis provided further clues. An examination of her teeth revealed a pronounced overbite and 3 dental fillings in her lower molars. Despite having some dental care in the past, many of her teeth were badly decayed by the time of her death. A forensic anthropologist also noted growth arrest lines in the girl's thigh bones, signs that she had experienced periods of malnutrition or serious illness during childhood. Her skeletal anatomy had some unusual features, which may help identify her. She had only 22 ribs instead of the normal 24, and her skull was asymmetric. This is a trait that may have been visible in her facial appearance during life, and which a forensic reconstruction team later took into account. These anomalies could indicate a congenital condition or health issues in her youth. There were no obvious signs of healed fractures or traumatic injuries on the bones to indicate past trauma. The medical examiner officially listed the cause and manner of death as undetermined, given the lack of conclusive forensic evidence. Despite this finding, this didn't change the way the authorities handled this investigation. From the start, law enforcement and the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences worked to put a name to a girl who was soon dubbed the Smurfette Jane Doe. They uploaded her case into national databases. A NamUs profile was created within 2 weeks of the discovery, and her DNA and dental records were made available for comparison. Investigators compared her description against countless missing person reports, but found no obvious match. This was concerning as by all accounts she was a young girl, yet no family or friend had reported her missing. Further, the case received fairly substantial media coverage at the time, which concerningly didn't prompt anyone to come forward to claim who she was. In early 2013, a breakthrough in forensic testing offered a new lead. Isotope analysis of the girl's bones, essentially chemical signatures from the water and food she consumed, suggested she likely grew up not in Houston, but in central or north-central Texas. The results were very consistent with regions around Austin and San Antonio. Authorities even reached out to law enforcement across the U.S.-Mexico border, considering the possibility that the girl or her relatives could have been from Mexico or Central America. Over the years, at least 17 missing girls were compared and ruled out as potential identities for the Smurfette doe. With no identification and scant evidence about her life, several theories have emerged about who the Smurfette Jane Doe was and how she met her fate. Investigators and amateur sleuths have considered a few primary possibilities based on the clues available. One prevailing theory is that the teen was caught up in trafficking. The area where her body was dumped was known for illicit activity. These factors suggest she may have been exploited and possibly slain when she was no longer seen as useful or became a liability. Investigators note that victims of this often live transient lives and are estranged from family, which could explain why no one reported her missing. Another theory is that the girl was a runaway or otherwise disconnected from her family. She may have left or been forced out of an unstable home, ending up living on the streets or with people who didn't have her best interests at heart. The fact that no family came forward and that she appeared to have suffered neglect supports the idea that she likely had a very difficult upbringing, to say the least. It's possible she was never reported missing because those who should have reported her gone, her family, or any other guardians, were either unable or unwilling to do so. In a tragic scenario, she could have been slain by someone she encountered while living on the margins, such as a predator who preyed on vulnerable young people. This theory also aligns with comments from the authorities, who found it unusual that a girl her age received so little attention when she vanished. It's also considered that the Smurfette Jane Doe wasn't from the region. Scientific evidence backs this up. Isotope tests indicated she spent her childhood in another part of Texas, like the Austin or San Antonio region, rather than Houston. That said, isotope testing is imprecise, at least compared to other forms of forensic testing such as DNA. Investigators explored leads in Mexico and Central America on the chance that she was a missing person from outside the country. If she was undocumented or far from her birthplace, it would be less likely for local authorities to link her to a missing child report. Unfortunately for investigators, the evidence simply doesn't conclusively point to one scenario or meaningfully narrow down the case. Despite the passage of time, the case of the Smurfette Jane Doe has not been forgotten. A major development came in 2021 when cutting-edge forensic genetic genealogy was applied to her case. As of now, this investigation remains ongoing. Forensic genealogists working on this Jane Doe's case have reported some progress in narrowing down her possible background. Preliminary findings from the DNA research have hinted at certain family surnames and regions that might be connected to her origins. However, at present, none of this information is publicly available due to the ongoing nature of the investigation and the present uncertainties. I suspect that given the unusual nature of her passing, the authorities likely have to consider the very real possibility that her family was actively involved in her demise as well. This, of course, creates some difficulty when going public with family names or potential relatives. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Now let's get back to business. On February 28, 1983, two men scavenging for scrap metal made a gruesome discovery in the basement of an abandoned apartment building on Clemens Avenue in St. Louis. In a dark furnace room, the flicker of a lighter revealed the body of a young girl lying face down. Most shockingly, her head had been removed, presumably in an attempt to make identification that much more difficult. The startled men ran to call the police, who arrived within minutes to begin investigating the horrific crime. Even seasoned officers were shaken by the brutality of the scene. Detectives noted the victim appeared very young and she was later estimated to be between 8 and 11 years old. Now, I'm not going to get into the exact details of what happened to her leading up to her passing. That said, an autopsy revealed that she had been forced to endure unimaginable horrors prior to meeting her end. And seriously, I strongly recommend not looking further into those details. As little evidence was found in the basement itself, the apartment is believed to have been used as a dump site rather than where the crime took place. Mold growth on her remains suggested she had been dead about 5 days when discovered, placing her slaying around February 23, 1983. Investigators immediately launched an intensive search of the surrounding area. They canvassed a 16-block radius and combed through sewers, trash cans, and alleyways for any evidence, but they found nothing useful. To this day, her head has never been found, a factor that has severely hindered efforts to identify her. From the outset, St. Louis police faced immense challenges in this case. Identifying the victim was the top priority, as knowing who she was could point to who might have been responsible for this reprehensible act. Investigators dubbed the unknown girl Jane Doe as per usual, but the media later nicknamed her Little Jane Doe, or Precious Hope, as the case gained attention. According to an interview with retired detectives Leroy Adkins and Joseph Burgoon, among the first on scene, they believed solving the case would be straightforward. They were of the view that once they were able to identify the girl's name, they could easily piece together her last days and figure out who was responsible. However, that identification has proved elusive for more than 40 years. In this interview, Adkins said, quote, "It's unimaginable to me that a kid can come up missing and no one knows a thing." This was essentially his expression of frustration that no friends, family, or neighbors ever reported a girl of that age missing. Police quickly realized the victim might not be a local at all. Exhaustive checks of school rosters in St. Louis and surrounding districts turned up no unaccounted students matching her description. Given the horrors associated with the case and who the victim was, the case went nationwide. Authorities circulated the girl's description to law enforcement agencies across the country, and reports from all 50 states were reviewed for any possible match. Detectives even placed ads about the case in African-American focused newspapers and magazines around the U.S., hoping to reach communities that might recognize the child. Despite these efforts, no solid leads on her identity emerged. The investigation into the slaying itself was similarly exhaustive. Crime scene evidence was limited but carefully collected. Besides her clothing and the bindings used on her hands, investigators noted the sweater seemed recently purchased, and her fingernails were painted with 2 coats of nail polish. X-rays showed no old fractures or signs of prior malnutrition. Curiously, from the evidence the police were able to gather, the girl appeared well cared for in life. This made the lack of any missing persons report even more baffling. Police worked with the FBI's behavioral science unit to profile the perpetrator, but without knowing the victim's identity, developing a suspect profile was difficult. Investigators theorized that the perp had some familiarity with the area, since they managed to find an out-of-the-way abandoned building to conceal the body. The sheer brutality of the crime suggested the perpetrator might even have been someone close to the victim, perhaps a relative or guardian, trying to prevent her from being recognized. On the other hand, investigators couldn't rule out a stranger attack or a serial offender. In the first year, police followed every tip and lead, but all fizzled out. After 9 months with no progress, the girl's remains were finally laid to rest on December 2nd, 1983, in a pauper's grave at Washington Park Cemetery. A brief funeral service was attended by members of the police force and concerned members of the community. The investigation, however, was far from over, and St. Louis detectives remained determined to find answers, and over the years the case would take many twists and turns. Over time, Numerous theories and possible connections to other crimes have been explored in this Jane Doe case. Investigators considered various scenarios to explain how a child could be slain and drop off the face of the earth without anyone coming forward to claim her, not even a teacher. One early theory was that the victim had lived a vagrant or otherwise hidden life. For example, perhaps she was kept out of school, or her family situation was such that her absence went unreported. Detectives thought it possible that her mother or father could have been involved in the slaying or cover-up. Another idea was that the girl's mother might have been incarcerated or deceased at the time, leaving her in a tenuous situation. Under this theory, some have considered whether the girl and her family could have been living on the outskirts of society, and all of them were targeted by an opportunistic predator. This would explain why no one reported her missing. Besides these broader theories, investigators chased many specific leads linking the case to known criminals or similar crimes. To give just one example, police investigated a reportedly similar case in Chicago around that time, in hopes the cases might be related, but ultimately nothing ended up matching up. Several missing girls were compared, and at least 4 were conclusively ruled out as being the Jane Doe. The authorities looked for any cases of perpetrators who had behaved similarly or had similar victim profiles. Investigators looked into a suspect who had been convicted in Alabama and was suspected in similar crimes in St. Louis. That said, there was no evidence tying him to this case, but the similarity in modus operandi was noted. Some theories proposed were highly unusual. A private investigator who worked for insurance companies came forward with one of the strangest theories that authorities actually investigated. She claimed that Jane Doe was actually a Native American who had been incorrectly identified as black due to the demographics of the neighborhood and the lack of facial evidence. She also claimed to have solid evidence to suggest that the perpetrator was a drifter from Texas. So I wasn't able to confirm why the authorities took this tip so seriously, given that it didn't line up with any information or evidence on the case. My guess is that this insurance investigator was a former police officer, as certain departments of insurance companies, like their fraud divisions, tend to hire former cops. At any rate, this tip was thoroughly investigated and deemed completely baseless. Among all the leads, one suspect named Vernon Brown stood out as particularly plausible to investigators. Brown was a twice-condemned perpetrator in Missouri. He was active in St. Louis during the time and was committing similar crimes during the period when this slaying took place. Detectives have theorized that the unidentified girl might have been the daughter of his girlfriend, which could explain why no family reported her missing. In 2005, just before Brown got the Old Yeller Special, detectives visited him in prison and pleaded for a confession or any information on the case. Brown, however, remained completely cold and silent on the matter, refusing to admit any involvement. He was subsequently eliminated, without any confirmation that he had been involved in the slaying of this Jane Doe. As the years passed, technological advancements in forensic science provided new avenues to investigate this case. In the early 1980s, DNA profiling wasn't yet available for criminal cases, and databases of missing persons were rudimentary. By the 2010s, however, DNA and other forensic techniques had improved dramatically. In 2013, the St. Louis police decided to exhume Jane Doe's remains to take advantage of modern science. This plan hit an unexpected snag. When investigators went to Washington Park Cemetery, they couldn't locate her grave. The old, overgrown cemetery's records were in disarray, and her burial plot had no headstone. Remarkably, a team of researchers from Washington University in St. Louis stepped in to help. They used old funeral photographs and mapping technology to pinpoint the exact spot of the unmarked grave, In June 2013, her remains were finally exhumed, allowing experts to retrieve bone samples and new DNA evidence. The exhumation opened the door for advanced forensic tests. Scientists conducted isotope analysis on the girl's bones, examining mineral deposits that accumulate based on local water and food, to infer where she may have lived during her life. The results suggested that she likely spent her childhood outside of Missouri, aligning with investigators' suspicions that she was not originally from St. Louis. Specifically, one analysis pointed toward states in the Mid-Atlantic or Midwest, including regions like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, West Virginia, Michigan, Minnesota, or Wisconsin. Another set of tests indicated possible ties to southeastern states such as North or South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee, or Texas. In either case, the consensus was that her geographic origins were likely not local to St. Louis, which helped explain why no local school or family had missing reports matching her. The isotope clues were broad, but they narrowed the scope of the search for relatives. A full DNA profile of the victim was obtained and entered into national databases in hopes of matching it either to a relative or to the unidentified remains of the missing head. Ultimately, unfortunately, no match was made. The girl's remains were reburied in a much more dignified resting place. She was interred in the Garden of Innocents at Calvary Cemetery, which is a special area for unidentified children. So the big question I have with this case is whether this Jane Doe's DNA has been submitted to Othram or a similar service for familial DNA testing. As detectives noted initially, finding relatives of the girl would make this case substantially more straightforward than it is now. In this case, it's even possible that genetic genealogy may not just lead to family members who can identify her, but also to the perpetrators themselves. In the mid-1970s, an elusive serial perpetrator terrorized San Francisco's gay community, preying on men he met in night spots and earning the nickname the Doodler. Between early 1974 and late 1975, at least 5 men were brutally slain, and several others assaulted, by an unidentified assailant who would sketch his targets before attacking. The Doodler's known crime spree spanned roughly 18 months. The first victim was discovered in the early hours of January 27, 1974, when the body of 50-year-old Gerald Earl Kavanaugh was found on Ocean Beach in San Francisco. Kavanaugh had been stabbed multiple times and showed defensive wounds. His slaying initially drew very little public attention. A few months later, on June 25, 1974, the perpetrator struck again. Joseph Stevens was found deceased near Spreckles Lake in Golden Gate Park. Stevens had been seen at a club the night before, and police believed he left with the suspect and was slain shortly afterward. The violence continued into the summer of 1974 as panic set in across the city and in the targeted community. On July 7, 1974, the body of Klaus Christmann, a 31-year-old German immigrant, was discovered at Ocean Beach. Christmann was married and had children, and the authorities thought he might have been closeted given the era's social climate. By this point, investigators began to suspect a pattern. The similar modus operandi and victim profile prompted police to link the cases. After a brief lull in the latter half of 1974, the perpetrator struck several more times in 1975. On April 27, 1975, 52-year-old Warren Andrews, a lawyer, was assaulted at Land's End, a coastal park not far from the prior Ocean Beach crime scenes. Andrews was bludgeoned with a rock and branch rather than stabbed, and he never regained consciousness, dying weeks later from his injuries. Notably, Warren Andrews was only connected to the Doodler by the authorities in 2022. This recent revelation suggests that there may be even more crimes linked to the doodler than are publicly known. Just 2 weeks after the Andrews attack, on May 12, 1975, the body of Frederick Elmer Capon, 32, was found on Ocean Beach. Like the others, Capon had been stabbed in the torso, and evidence at the scene suggested his body had been dragged roughly 20 feet, indicating an attempt to conceal the crime. Capon, a Vietnam War veteran and nurse, was identified via fingerprints. The final known victim, Harold Goldberg, 66, was discovered on June 4th, 1975 in Lincoln Park. He was discovered in a state of advanced decomposition. Notably, there has been some controversy as to whether Goldberg was a victim of the doodler, given that he was substantially older than the other men who were slain. In addition to these acts, at least 3 men survived attacks believed to be by the doodler. And what you're about to hear is extremely unfortunate, as it's proof positive that there was enough evidence to bring this monster to justice, at least at a certain point. In July 1975, within 2 weeks of each other, 2 different men were stabbed in the Fox Plaza area of San Francisco, but managed to survive. One of them later told police he encountered the assailant late at night in a diner that was known to be a gay-friendly hangout by locals. The man had been sketching animal figures on a napkin and claimed to be an art student studying to be a cartoonist. This charming approach, offering a drawing and engaging in conversation, was likely how the perp gained the trust of his victims. The tactic proved tragically effective at luring men to isolated spots. Another survivor in October 1975 spent considerable time with the suspect and provided detectives with a detailed description. These first-hand accounts allowed police to create a composite sketch of the attacker, depicting a young black man with a slender build. From the beginning, the doodler investigation was hampered by the social climate of the time and the elusive nature of the perpetrator. After the early slayings in 1974, San Francisco police noted the commonalities and realized a single offender might be responsible. The surviving victim's testimony in 1975 was a major break. Their information yielded a police composite sketch in 1975, which was circulated to help identify the suspect. Tips poured in. One anonymous caller even provided a name and a license plate number that pointed to a potential suspect. Acting on these leads, SFPD detectives identified a strong suspect and brought him in for an interview in January 1976. This individual was a young man fitting the description, an African-American male in his early 20s, around 5'11" with a lanky build. By then, however, the string of known doodler assaults had stopped, and investigators faced a critical hurdle. That is to say, lack of cooperation from key witnesses. Several men had survived encounters with the doodler, including the 2 from summer 1975 and one other earlier victim, but none were willing to publicly testify against the suspect. In the 1970s, coming out as a gay man carried immense stigma and personal risk. According to a 1977 report, 2 of the 3 survivors were prominent individuals. One of them was described as, quote, a well-known entertainer, while another was described as a prominent diplomat. Without their testimony, prosecutors had no strong case, since physical evidence linking the suspect to the crimes was scant. The suspect himself cooperated with a police interview but denied committing the acts, and with no willing witnesses and no confession, authorities had to release him. Investigators were convinced they had the right man. One officer later said they strongly believed the detained individual was indeed the doodler. Decades later, in an effort to reignite the case, San Francisco police artists used this to quote-unquote hypothesize how the doodler might look as a much older man. And given what we know, and what the police appear to know, I really have to believe this image must be quite exact. The updated rendering was released to the public, reflecting the suspect in his 60s or 70s. Authorities hoped that modern eyes might recognize the face after so many years, and that someone might finally be willing to speak up with information. Throughout the investigation, law enforcement faced numerous challenges beyond uncooperative witnesses. The crimes occurred in an era when forensic technology was limited, DNA profiling didn't exist, and other physical evidence was often not enough to conclusively tie a suspect to a crime, at least to the exacting standards required by our legal system. In one intriguing twist, a psychiatrist contacted police in late 1975, claiming that one of his patients had confessed to being the doodler. This doctor, known only by the pseudonym Dr. Priest, after the practice of confession, even gave a name to investigators, seemingly corroborating the suspect they had in mind. Yet, because the survivors refused to identify the suspect in court, and the alleged confession came through a second-hand source bound by medical confidentiality, the case didn't progress. By the end of the 1970s, the Doodler investigation had gone cold, despite an array of extremely promising leads that never fully materialized into a resolvable case. It's chilling to note that after the police sketch was publicized and a suspect was interviewed, the Doodler stopped his attacks. This suggested that the person responsible was scared by the heat, and also strongly suggests that the interviewed party was the Doodler. Given the evidence gathered, police and crime experts have formed theories about who the Doodler might be and what drove him to commit this series of heinous acts. The leading theory is that the unnamed man detained in 1976 was indeed the perpetrator. Investigators have quietly kept tabs on this individual over the years. In fact, he remains a person of interest decades later. As of the early 2020s, SFPD confirmed they have re-interviewed the same man and that he is still under suspicion, though he has not been publicly named at present. The man is believed to be living in California's East Bay region and would likely be in his early 70s based on the evidence that's been released. Officially, no charges have ever been filed, but the consensus among those familiar with the case is that authorities have something just shy of certainty as to who the Doodler is. And this isn't one of those cases where authorities have a strong inkling. They really seem to have near absolute confirmation as to who the guy actually is. This is a case where we have multiple high-profile people who were unwilling to testify against him due to personal concerns about their orientation coming out in open court. Combine this with the fact that a psychiatrist came forward to advise that the Doodler himself confessed, and well, there's a real evidentiary quagmire. All of these parties provided independent confirmation that the Doodler was the same person, but due to an unwillingness to testify and medical confidentiality, the authorities have their hands tied. Another important question is, what exactly would drive someone to commit these sick crimes? Both professional criminal profilers and online sleuths have noted that the Doodler's pattern suggests a complex and conflicted motive. All evidence indicates that the Doodler engaged in relationships with the men before ending them. Some have speculated that the perpetrator might have been grappling with his own identity, and that attempting to repress his identity led to a horrific outbreak in serial violence. Another theory about the Doodler's motive is rooted in the social shame of the time. It's important to remember that even in San Francisco in the 1970s, the police had an extremely strained relationship with the gay community. This community had faced decades of abuse at the hands of the authorities. In general, at best, the community was wary of the police. Since all known victims were part of the community, even if only on a closeted basis, the perpetrator may have chose to operate in a community reluctant to engage with law enforcement. Some investigators theorize he deliberately targeted men who, he assumed, would be reluctant to report attacks. This could point to a predator who cynically took advantage of society's bias. Unfortunately, I have some doubts about whether the doodler will ever be brought to justice, and this fact is made more concerning by the fact that he is likely still alive. At present, given that the doodler is subject to an active and ongoing investigation, it's unclear if his DNA evidence has been logged. However, given that the suspect has been re-interviewed in recent years, I suspect this isn't the case. At present, the most realistic chance appears to be having the authorities lean on one of the witnesses who survived their encounters with this monster. If any of these three men are still alive, they likely hold the only remaining keys to realistically cracking these cases and bringing justice for the victims. Also, as I was editing, I realized why the doodler likely never struck again. I suspect that given the strength of the evidence against him, the SFPD has likely had this guy under intermittent surveillance for the last half-century. King Sebastian I of Portugal was a young monarch with grand ambitions fueled by religious zeal. Ascending to the throne at just 3 years old in 1557, he grew up under the guidance of Jesuit tutors who instilled in him a fanatical sense of mission. As Sebastian came of age, he became convinced that he was destined to lead a crusade against the Muslim powers of North Africa and restore Christian rule there. This fervent belief in a sacred mission defined his reign. By his late teens, the king was impatient to prove himself on the battlefield and to expand Portugal's influence. He poured his energy into planning a military expedition to Morocco against the cautious advice of his older counselors. In 1578, King Sebastian launched his long-awaited campaign overseas, an adventure that would culminate in his mysterious disappearance and plunge Portugal into turmoil. Sebastian's crusading enterprise led to the Battle of the Three Kings on August 4th, 1578, a confrontation in northern Morocco that would decide his fate and that of the Portuguese Empire. The young king had allied with Mohammed II, a deposed Moroccan sultan who sought to reclaim his throne. In the summer of 1578, Sebastian landed in Morocco with a Portuguese-led invasion force of around 25,000 men, including Portuguese nobles, foreign mercenaries, and Moroccan allies. They marched inland under the blazing sun, determined to challenge the new Moroccan ruler, Sultan Abd al-Malik. On the plains near Qasr el-Kabir, the Portuguese coalition met a vastly superior Moroccan army. Portuguese planning and intelligence was extremely poor, and this battle was lost long before Sebastian and company made it to the battlefield. The Moroccan Sultan had received reinforcements from the powerful Ottoman Turks and was boasting a modern army with at least 60,000 men. When battle started, King Sebastian personally rode along his lines to rally his troops for the glory he envisioned. Despite initial confidence, the fight quickly turned against the Portuguese. Abd al-Malik, though gravely ill, led his forces from horseback, and the Moroccan army executed a bold plan to encircle the invaders. Early in the battle, a cannonball struck down one of Sebastian's key commanders, throwing the Portuguese center into confusion. Moroccan cavalry then surged around both flanks of Sebastian's army. After hours of fierce combat, the Portuguese lines crumbled under the pressure. The result was a catastrophic defeat. Thousands of Portuguese and their allies were slain, including nearly virtually all the entire high nobility of Portugal. It's estimated that the 15,000 survivors were taken captive and sold, mostly to work the galleys of the various Barbary pirates. Only a handful of Portuguese troops and their allies escaped the carnage. King Sebastian was last seen fighting valiantly amid his doomed troops, refusing to retreat even as the situation became hopeless. Amid the chaos and slaughter, the 24-year-old king vanished. His body was never conclusively identified on the field, leaving contemporaries uncertain whether he had perished or somehow survived the debacle. The Moroccan Sultan Abd al-Malik died during the battle, and Sebastian's ally drowned while fleeing. Notably, all three kings involved in the battle met their end that day. The battle's outcome was a disaster for Portugal, wiping out a generation of its leadership and ending Sebastian's ill-fated crusade in utter defeat. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, King Sebastian's fate became an enduring mystery. The most straightforward explanation is that he died in battle, as most of his men did. Indeed, given the overwhelming defeat and the fact that he was last seen surrounded by enemy forces, it's highly likely Sebastian was slain on the field. However, the failure to locate and positively identify his body gave rise to widespread speculation and hope that the young king might have somehow survived. In Portugal, a legend grew that Sebastian had escaped the battlefield, perhaps taken captive incognito or wandering in exile, and that he would one day return to his people. This messianic hope came to be known as Sebastianism. Sebastian's people, grief-stricken by the loss and facing an uncertain future, clung to the idea that their king would reappear in Portugal's darkest hour to save the nation. For years after 1578, rumors swirled of sightings and secret letters, all suggesting that Sebastian lived on in disguise. The belief in Sebastian's survival was so strong that it encouraged a series of false Sebastians to come forward in the decades after the battle. Between the 1580s and early 1600s, at least 4 different impostors declared themselves to be the missing monarch. These pretenders emerged in both Portugal and Spain, exploiting the popular longing for Sebastian's return. One particularly convincing false Sebastian was working as a baker in a Spanish town, when his colleagues noted that he could speak German and French, in addition to Spanish and Portuguese. Needless to say, it was a rarity for a simple baker to speak 4 languages at the time, and the stack of languages he spoke suggested he was from the high nobility. This baker, who was likely actually a Spanish man named Gabriel de Espinosa, was able to masquerade as Sebastian for a few months before the authorities ended his charade. Sebastian's disappearance had immediate and far-reaching consequences for Portugal. With the young king gone and no direct heir, the Portuguese monarchy faced a succession crisis. The king's elderly great-uncle, Cardinal Henry, assumed the throne. However, Henry was a celibate clergyman, and at nearly 70 years old, had no heirs of his own. He ruled for only 2 years, dying in 1580 and plunging Portugal further into a dynastic dispute. Backed by his powerful armies and a strong claim, Philip II of Spain invaded Portugal in 1580 to seize the throne. After defeating the remaining forces loyal to the Portuguese crown, Philip was proclaimed Philip I of Portugal in 1581, uniting the Spanish and Portuguese crowns. This began the period known as the Iberian Union, a dynastic union under the Spanish Habsburgs that lasted for 60 years. For Portugal, being absorbed into the Iberian Union marked the loss of the nation's independent sovereignty. Under Spanish rule, Portugal was governed by a foreign monarch, and although it retained formal autonomy in its laws and colonial administration, in practice the country became a junior partner. The consequences were significant. Portuguese colonies and trade were pulled into Spain's conflicts, and the once proud Portuguese navy and commerce suffered neglect. The disappearance of Sebastian thus inadvertently led to a decline in Portugal's standing and the end of its golden age of exploration and prosperity. In 1640, the Portuguese finally revolted and restored independence under the House of Braganza, ending the Iberian Union. However, the legacy of Sebastian's ill-fated crusade had already completely reshaped the course of Portuguese history. He had sought to win glory for his kingdom, but instead, his loss brought about a period of crisis and subjugation.